partner with them and cut our costs by collaboration, like what Ron Webb would say. But those are the things that we're working on as an electric utility, and I think some of those things can cross over, and we don't have to start at ground zero with a lot of that stuff. So at this point, I'd like to introduce our moderator, David Gomberg. David's area crosses ours, whole northern district, 10th district. David's been serving us for 6 years, and he's making it.
Everyone for being with us this afternoon to talk about what I think is one of the biggest and most significant issues that we're going to need to address going forward for our generation. Corps of Engineers, Chris Cummings, Executive Director of Infrastructure Finance with Business Oregon, Brendan Finn, Transportation Policy Advisor for Governor Kate Brown, and finally Andrew Phelps, the Director of Oregon Emergency Management. And I'm going to have a question for them in a moment to start things off, but I want to begin with a question for all of you. I've got a question for all of you, and that question is, right now, where you're sitting, are we inside the inundation? One or two-word response to that question, grading us between A and F. And I'll take pluses and minuses, but on a scale of A to F, how well prepared are we right now for what we expect is going to happen in the foreseeable future? And I'll just start way over on the far end with Brendan.
You were going to start with me. Let's start with the professor. Well, I would say, I'd say C+ with plans to get to an A.
All right, very good.
We'll talk about what those are today.
We'll talk about that. Chris?
Just kidding. Actually, I'm not a doomsdayer, but frankly, I would say D, and the reason I say that is when I look at our water systems and the age of the systems and our ports facilities and our highway facilities, I think we have a ways to go. However, it is starting to catch on. It's brought about by this conference, so I think we're moving in the right direction.
Sir, as the one Fed on the stage here, I feel reluctant to say what I think the state of Oregon said, so I'll answer from the federal perspective and where we think we are. And I would say we're a C- and going up as far as the federal. We're doing lots of work, is trying to get better to be able to respond from a federal perspective. And it was a trick question. I didn't get to ask my smart folks, so I might have a different answer from that.
Pass the microphone over to Dr. Ashford.
Oh man, so as
You're used to grading people.
That's right. So I would say the whole state's on probation right now. Make sure we make it right to graduation. But I'd say the coast, I'd give the coast a B because you're doing so many of the right things here on the coast.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that assessment of the B across the board for the coast. We're above average, I think, on the coast, but there's always going to be more work to be done.
All right, so folks, that gives you kind of a quick overview of where people see us in our preparation for what may be happening. So we're here to talk about resiliency, and maybe we should start by asking, what is resiliency? We're going to need to move fast today because we've got about an hour and a lot of questions and a lot of people to share some responses. Who wants to jump in on that one? What is resiliency? What are we talking about?
So for me, I look at resiliency as the ability to bounce back after an event. It's not preventing all damage. It's not having things exactly the way they were after the event, but it's the ability of that community to bounce back.
Anybody else? Bouncing back.
I would just say from the federal, the Corps of Engineers are responsible for, as folks know, in this room, navigation, the jetties, and from the jetties perspective, resilience means that can they still function, and to what level can they function after they withstand an event. And so being resilient means you still have some functionality as we go.
Anybody else have anything to share on that, Chris?
Well, I think being at the coast, we often obviously think of earthquake, seismic, and tsunami, but it also relates to other things we've seen along the coast in other areas, such as wildfires and other natural events. So it's being able to get available services back up after all those events.
I think the word resilience to me, when I think of something that's resilient, I think of something simple like a rubber band. A rubber band is inherently resilient. You can stretch it and it goes back to how it was before it was stretched. I don't know if that's how we want to be. I think when we get stretched, we need to do stuff to prevent us from stretching or turn into something better, a binder clip or something, so that we're not keep getting stretched. We're rethinking what problem is we're trying to solve, what our infrastructure looks like, and how when we get stretched we can take that as an opportunity to become something better and maybe more useful.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to ask you a harder question now. And that harder question is, we've got some people who are saying we should abandon the coast right now. The coast is toast. Everything west of I-5 is in trouble. We should just abandon this area right now because it's going to be totally obliterated. I've got other people that contact me every day, and they are cascade deniers. It's not going to happen in the next 500 years. We shouldn't spend a lot of time and energy and worry, and certainly not a whole lot of money getting ready for it. My question to all of you is, what is the coast going to look like in the next 10 or 20 years?
Whether it's the tsunami or the Cascadia event, I think I see communities that are approaching this with their eyes open, right? We're not shutting down areas, banning construction because there'll be a tsunami sometime in the future, but looking at appropriate facilities. You know, Oregon State built the Marine Science Building in Newport as a vertical evacuation, right, to make that South Beach area safe, right? Appropriate building in that space. There are emergency facilities, other types of facilities outside of this, outside of tsunami.
Anybody else? What's the coast going to look like in 10 to 20 years, or what should it look like?
I would just like to say what he said.
Okay. Well, you know, and my answer to that, because as a policymaker, I get asked that question, and my answer is we're not going to live in fear. We're going to prepare, educate ourselves. We're going to be ready to withstand, and we're going to take the steps that are necessary to recover. And that includes education. That includes infrastructure investments. That includes preparing emergency supplies and giving people directions, not only for the people that live here, but the many more people that come and visit us here, so that everybody can come to the coast and feel confident, feel secure that we're doing everything we can to be ready for a major event. Well, let me get specific with each of you, and I've got a couple of questions for each of you. Chris, if I could, I'll begin with you, because during the last legislative session, I had asked some pointed questions about our ability to make investments for resiliency, particularly here at the coast, particularly within the inundation zone, and the answer I got was under the current rules, we have grants available, but those grants are not available to projects that are identified within the inundation zone. Is that still the case? Are there changes being contemplated? What's going on with grants and the money that the state makes available to help us better prepare?
Well, that is still the case for one particular program. The Business Oregon offers a very sizable program for seismic retrofitting of schools and emergency service buildings and hospitals with trauma centers. And that particular program had a rule that we could not offer those grants for retrofitting schools and like buildings within the tsunami inundation zone. And we found out during the last legislative session from a very charismatic legislator that maybe that wasn't the right way to go with the investments that we have in these communities. As we talked about today, the communities will still be here. We want to plan for the future, not abandon the future. So we took that back to, we have a committee that's over 20 people, experts around the state, and they heard the message and they recommended that we change the rules. So now that schools and emergency service buildings in a flood, in the tsunami zone could in fact apply for these grants, which are sizable. They're up to $2.5 million for each facility. It also opened our eyes to look at, we had a requirement that you couldn't be in a floodplain, and these are seismic grants, right? And so if you get a few inches of water, does that really impact your seismic structure? So we wanted to look at that. So what we're doing now is we're going through a rulemaking process. Our committee instructed us to do that, and hopefully, I believe by the end of this year, before our next round, which will be later this year, early next year, we'll have rules in place that allows for that seismic retrofitting in inundation zones.
All right, thank you. Scott, I've got a question for you. As I hope most people in the audience know, this last session we passed House Bill 3309, which repeals a 30-year-old statute prohibiting any new critical facilities, schools, fire departments, police stations, hospitals, within the inundation zone. And there's been a great deal of discussion about that change at both the state level and at the national level. What do you think? Were we on the right track, or did we make a big mistake?
Yeah, so let me start by, I think when we put in the line 30 years ago, we were really some of the leaders in the nation at doing the best with the information that we had on what, prohibiting some construction in the beyond the L line, right? What we talked about. But if you look at today, you look at how much we've learned about tsunamis, about vertical evacuation, about work that Oregon State is doing on the loads that tsunamis put on structures. I think 3309 is a step in the right direction. And I think what has to be followed up then is implementing of what we call OCCES 716. It's the tsunami guidelines, nationally vetted, that are really the state of the coming state of the practice. The Marine Studies Building in Newport used that, and the old DOGAMI guidelines, and the OCCES 7 guidelines govern that design. And I think that's the future. I think the HB 3309 was a step in the right direction. It's got to be followed then with really adopting appropriate building codes for tsunami areas.
And those are building codes that have currently been recognized in California and in Washington State?
That is correct, and it's I think having several agencies that are involved, DOGAMI, building codes, state lands, working together in the state to make that happen, I think is the right approach.
And we are actually planning to introduce legislation to do exactly that in the short session that'll be convening early next year. So, well, thank you for that observation. Kevin, I want to ask you, what's the Corps' role in all of this? What are the feds going to do when something happens here, particularly our ports? Our ports are going to be a lifeline, but we need to make sure they're operable. When something happens here, how does the Corps plan to respond?
Thank you, sir. First of all, I'd like to just say that please know that we in the Corps, we have 1,400 employees in the Portland District, most of which live in Oregon, and we understand the role that we play for the normal communities. Just maintaining the navigation channels, especially on the Oregon coast, are extremely important. The way that, and in preparing for, we kind of look at three phases. One is kind of planning phase, and what happens during response, and then recovery at the end. And so the first thing we do is we're trying to establish relationships, and in fact, our emergency management chief, Lance Lindsay, is here today. And Lance, if you wouldn't mind standing up, where do you go? There he is, Lance Lindsay. So if you want for local communities, please say hi. What we do is under Public Law 8499, which allows us to prepare for planning. We get funding every year, and therefore we're doing everything from exercises, training, etc., to help ensure that we work with other federal agencies and work with locals and work with you all to be prepared. And I guess the third big thing that we do is we have a Stafford Act, Public Law 93-288. The Stafford Act basically talks about how do 27 federal agencies and the Red Cross, how do we work together under FEMA when it comes time that there is an emergency, and how do we respond as a federal agency? If you're not familiar with the Stafford Act, there are a thing called ESFs, Emergency Support Functions. There are 15 of these functions. For instance, ESF 1 is transportation, ESF 2 is communications, EFS 8 is public health and medical, ESF 3 is public works and engineering. And so in an emergency, the Corps is responsible for ESF 3. And we would come in, and ESF 3 includes such things as temporary emergency power, providing for debris management and cleanup, water and ice, providing for water and ice in an emergency, temporary roofing, and then we also support other agencies in their ESF responsibilities. For instance, ESF number 6 is mass care and housing, and we have a responsibility to be a support agency. So those are some of the things that we do in a little bit to prepare and what we would do in summer.
All right, thank you. Andrew, I've got a question for you. I've got a microphone for you. And then that is that when the event occurs, we're concerned that our main arterials to the valley are going to be cut off, that we're going to be isolated here, not only from the valley, but also from each other as our coastal bridges fail. So what steps are being taken to provide us with lifelines when those critical transportation infrastructures either fail or are compromised?
Thank you for the question. It's a legitimate concern and something that we're very worried about across the emergency management community. Working with our emergency support function partners, we've developed the Cascadia Playbook, which is a guide for the first 2 weeks following the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami in Oregon. And one of the first expectations that we have, first of all, is to identify those lifeline routes that can be most easily and quickly cleared from the valley to the coast to start moving commodities. But we know that's going to take time, probably longer than 2 weeks. So in addition to our constant message of encouraging Oregonians to be 2 weeks ready, we have supplies on hand to be self-sufficient without outside help for at least 2 weeks, which I know is difficult for a lot of folks to wrap their heads around and build that stockpile. But how can we move resources into those impacted areas? And what do those islands look like? We've developed an island mapping project where we've identified what islands we can expect to be created in Oregon along the coast because of landslides, because of debris, because of bridge collapse, and trying to parse out what's available on each of those islands so we can better identify what types of resources are going to be needed to sustain and save lives and to help us maintain situational awareness for disaster. So in addition to air operations, we've been assessing airports along the coast and throughout Oregon so we can develop kind of a spoke and hub concept where we can get key resources and supplies to these hubs and then distribute them to spokes, through spokes to additional hubs, and kind of continuing that so that hopefully within a matter of weeks we have every Oregonian that's impacted within less than a mile of a point of distribution for critical supplies. We've also been partnering with the Navy and have done some pretty unique things on the Oregon coast over the last 2 years involving landing Navy vessels actually on the shore, and the capability that the Navy and the Third Fleet brings in terms of water desalinization, medical supplies, patient evacuation, power provision, sheltering capabilities, and a host of other things that we're going to need during a disaster. So it's a wicked problem, it really is. If you followed the Hurricane Irma and Maria coverage, they kept talking about Puerto Rico being such a difficult response because it was an island. I'm sitting here in Oregon thinking, after Cascadia, we're going to have thousands of islands. So we need to figure this out. We've been having conversations with FEMA, learning lessons from their hurricane responses in the Caribbean, and seeing what can we do in advance? What types of resources do we need to have on hand? How do we need to prepare our communities and build emergency management capability, not just at the state level, but at the local level, where most of your counties on the coast have one person who's doing emergency management. One person. To prepare for really what's the worst natural disaster facing the country, in my opinion. So there's a lot of work to be done, but getting resources into the impacted communities and getting injured people out of the communities are going to be a priority for us in those first 2 weeks.
Brendan, I've got a question for you, and I apologize for not warning you about this in advance, but session before last, Oregon passed a generational change in how we fund transportation in Oregon. Billions of dollars available to work on our highways, our bridges, our roadways. And when I challenged ODOT for their long-term plans in use of those dollars, what they indicated to me is that they operate in 10-year segments. And in the context of emergency planning, they said their first priority would be to beef up our transportation network in Eastern Oregon, because it would be outside the earthquake area and would be the primary lifeline and transportation infrastructure for the state. So they'd be working on our highways and our airports in Eastern Oregon for the first 10 years. The second 10 years, they would shift to our population centers, our cities in the I-5 corridor and our Portland bridges, leaving the question of coastal infrastructure, our coastal highways, our coastal bridges, for the third 10-year portion of that plan, which on one hand strikes me as making good sense in terms of setting priorities, but yet is of little comfort to folks that live here and that are watching our bridges rust, our highways deteriorate. I just wanted to invite you to comment on whether you think that is indeed the message we're getting from ODOT, whether that reflects current priorities. What do we have to look forward to in terms of not just fixing potholes here at the coast, but major reinvestments in our bridges and our highways, given that many people believe that they're going to be knocked down when the ground starts shaking?
Well, let me unpack that one real quick. And you teed up one for me, even though I think I actually am prepared for this one. Last week I was down in Ashland with the Oregon Transportation Commission, and Paul Mather, who's serving as the interim director right now, gave a report basically on what we're going to do to be ready for a seismic event here on the coast, and some of the recent events post HB 2017, the transportation package that they're working on. So maybe I do have some good news to bring along. One of those things is that actually happened through the legislature this year that will help and prepare. I think watching what happened outside of Brookings last year, and I don't know if folks were aware of the 101, big portion of it actually, big swath of it collapsed. The pictures are, when I first saw them, were jaw-dropping. That piece of critical infrastructure created an island. It was a critical route to a community for all kinds of life safety issues. I think the agency said we need to pay more attention to this. They have come up with their Seismic Plus plan, and again, through the legislation that was passed in the last session, they're going to be creating these seismic triage points. 3 of them have been planned and funded. One of them will be in Astoria, one will be in Newport, and the other one will be in Coos Bay. These are very large maintenance facilities that are bigger than the normal ones that ODOT has, that will be outside the tsunami zones, that will have various pieces of gas and fuel and supplies and things to do quick repairs. So I think that that the agency is understanding that issue, and that the leadership of the OTC and the governor's office has them paying more attention to this issue. I know from that event, from the 101 collapse, they realized that people could not get through and that they did not have the right alternative routes identified. That's absolutely a priority for them right now. I think if Representative McEwen is in this room, she would tell you, as I think she said in the hearing, you know, the rain's going to come and these slides are going to keep coming, and there's no way of engineering your way out of it. So we have to look at these alternative routes. We have to look at other ways that we can be prepared. Those triage centers, I think, are going to make a big difference, and the plan is to have a whole series of them around the coast, a whole system of them, one on each island, to use Andrew's phrase there, because we're going to need them. And again, the airports are going to be absolutely critical for that response. So you may have gotten a bureaucratic engineering response representative, and I apologize for that. But I do think times have changed, and I do think the agency is taking it much more seriously.
Thank you for that.
How was that for I didn't. That's not a canned answer.
Nicely done. So, Scott, you touched on the developments in Newport with the new marine science building, and I wanted to come back to that. The construction is well underway. Some people dismiss it as a dangerous folly, that we shouldn't be constructing a facility there on South Beach in the inundation zone as part of the Hatfield Marine Science Center. Other people describe it as state-of-the-art, state of engineering, state of the architecture, world-class, leading example of how we can actually learn and do well within the inundation zone. I want to give you a chance to address those two alternatives and tell me, what do you think about the building that's going in there?
Yeah, you know, I think for the Marine Studies building, I think this is something that I said earlier, that you can't shut your eyes to Cascadia, and you just have to approach any development in the tsunami zone with your eyes open. And so this is a research facility. It is proximity to the water is important. And frankly, if you look at the development of the South Beach area in Newport, that vertical evacuation option actually increases the safety of the people in that zone. It gives them another chance.
Real quickly, vertical evacuation. What is vertical evacuation?
So the best thing, if you're in the inundation zone and you see the blue lines and the signs all over the coast, if you're in the inundation zone, the first thing is to try to get to high ground. We call that horizontal evacuation. But there's some communities on the Oregon coast where the people simply don't have time. And then you look at vertical evacuation. That is a evacuation point out of the worst case scenario, which is the XXL tsunami that Dogami talks about, where you have refuge. You may have some supplies, but it gets you out of that danger of the tsunami. And then you are then transferred, and after the tsunami's over, after a period of time, making sure there's not the second one is not coming, and you get to this horizontal, reinforce the ground all the way to solid ground through that liquefiable material on South Beach. We did the analyses where we actually looked at ships impacting on the building, taking a column out of the structure and making sure that the structure still stands, from our engineering analyses. We made sure that the bottom floors can essentially blow out with the tsunami, but leaving that refuge up on the top. And so by approaching this with our eyes open, by increasing the safety, particularly for people that are disabled or somehow have some impairment from the earthquake, giving them that second option, and also showing that it's not time to shut down and move completely out of the tsunami zone, but to really look at appropriate facilities like this ocean research facility, and make sure that we do it so that we're ready for the tsunami, we're ready for the earthquake, and frankly, we're increasing the safety of the zone, the area.
And we should also make it clear for the students that are going to be learning at this facility, the dormitories are not there in the inundation zone. They're the living quarters are up the hill outside of the inundation zone.
That's right. The planned student facility is outside the inundation zone. So when you're asleep, right, that's the last thing you want to do is worry about evacuating. But for the activities down on South Beach in that research area, that's the appropriate place for it.
And so what we're saying is that the geologists are telling us what to expect. The engineers are helping us figure out what to do about it. But I also have to say, for the accountant's benefit, it costs a heck of a lot more money to construct these kinds of innovations.
It's actually not. I mean, if you look at the Marine Science Building, we looked at the costs of the design that we're doing, and it did increase the cost by about 5%. But we are prepared.
Chris, I'm going to use that money segue because you touched on the fact that grants are available for seismic work, and that we're considering making changes in who can qualify for those dollars. But my question for you is there anywhere near enough money in that pot?
Well, we've gone through a couple $100 million already, and we have $120 million coming for this biennium. We're still probably, the numbers are difficult to tell based on past studies, but we're probably no more than halfway through all the state schools and emergency facilities.
Could you give folks an example of what kind of work is being done with those dollars?
So, for instance, in this school, we will retrofit a school so that the kids can, to an extent where the kids can get out of the school right away without the doorways falling on them or the building facades falling on them. Where we'll offer money for emergency service facilities, such as police and fire and the hospitals, certain hospitals, is immediate occupancy standards. So that means that after an earthquake or seismic event occurs, is that that building stays standing and people can use it after the event to do the emergency services that they need to do. So in other words, in the school, we don't anticipate the kids going back into school the next day, of course, right? But police stations, fire stations, trauma centers, they need to be open and ready to go right after the event. So we're funding retrofits for that.
Andrew, you've got a room full of community leaders from here at the coast. Your message for them, what do they need to be doing to improve their grade, to get better ready and better prepared for what we anticipate is going to happen?
Well, we've talked a lot about the resource investment in seismic stability, in the emergency management function itself, but I know there's a lot of competing priorities for those resources. So the one thing I think that everyone in this room can do, and that I'd love to see you all do, is talk about it. Have that conversation every time you're meeting with folks in your community, your constituents, your colleagues. Talk about how important it is to be prepared for not just earthquakes, not just this catastrophic tsunami, but for the wildfire, for the flood, for the winter storm that knocks out power to drain in Douglas County for 2 weeks. These are not catastrophic types of an event, but they're very impactful, and if folks aren't prepared, we're going to continue to have challenges with response. And preparedness is more than just stuff. I think that's an important message as well. Stuff is important. 2 weeks of food, 2 weeks of water, it's great, but there's a lot of folks in our communities that don't know how they're going to eat tonight, and telling them to put 2 weeks of food in a closet someplace just in case does not resonate with them. However, telling them to, or encouraging them to become first aid certified, how to evacuate their neighborhood should there be a wildfire, signing up for emergency alerts in their communities so that they can get critical, life-saving, official information when their community is being impacted by an event. Incredibly important and incredible return on that limited, small investment. Insurance is something we don't talk about very often. So many of our folks in our communities are uninsured or underinsured. That's going to really impact our ability to build back after an emergency or disaster at the level of individual insurance coverage. Emergency management in a lot of ways is a lot like insurance. When we're making budget cuts, When we're tightening our belts, emergency management sometimes doesn't get funded, or gets unfunded, or less funding. I know at home, if I've got to look at my expenses, you know, if I change my deductible level on my car insurance, is that going to save me a couple of bucks a month? Yeah. Now when I'm in a car accident, I'm wondering why it's so much more expensive. I'm wondering why it's so much more impactful because I cut my insurance. You don't know you need it until you need it. But having those conversations, it's much more impactful coming from community leaders than some doofus agency head sitting in Salem telling people to be prepared. So as you're out there talking, it doesn't take long just to say, hey, what's your plan for an emergency? Are you 2 weeks ready? What can we do locally, at the state level, even at the national level, to help our community be more prepared?
Well, I appreciate you raising that preparation question. One of the things that I've tried to do in Salem is introduce legislation to better use time in our schools to educate our kids. Right now, we are committing about half an hour each month to disaster drills. And disaster drills are exactly what they sound like, either hide under the desk or run outside the building. And like many people in this room, I'm of a generation where we prepared for natural disasters by hiding under our desks, and I'm not sure how constructive that was. But I would like to use that time more effectively to not talk about what to do when something happens, but rather how to get ready for it, and to make that educational program age appropriate. So our youngest kids are learning what to do if they get home and mom and dad couldn't get home. That slightly older kids would learn go kits. What do you put in a go kit? How many do you need? Where do you keep them? And that our older kids can be learning about first aid, they can be learning about communications, they can be learning about community involvement and teen cert. And I wanted to take the roughly 4 hours a year that we spend on disaster drills and instead put that into disaster education and disaster preparation, believing that education is generational, and that very often parents and grandparents learn from their kids and grandkids, and if we can use the schools as an educational foundation, that will help better prepare the entire community. And having kids come home and ask questions about why we don't have a go kit, what is our exit plan, and where do we gather if we can't gather here. So that legislation has not been successful yet, but it will be back again in the next long session. And part of the resistance has simply been that it's another unfunded mandate, that we need to be taking time from other kinds of education priorities and putting them into disaster education. I'm of a mind that and water preservation in the face of a major seismic event. Anybody have anything to add here?
Representative, I can say from Business Oregon standpoint, we have what's housed within our department, the Infrastructure Finance Authority, which is a governor-appointed board, and they're responsible for water financing, right? That's what the IFA, Infrastructure Finance Authority, does. We're a financing agency. And we do have opportunities for, right now, we're a little behind, I would suggest, but we have opportunities for grants for planning. We have these grants called SIP grants that allow for master planning and seismic planning elements as part of master plans to be funded with this grant. Generally speaking, our funds are loan funds, and it's difficult for communities to take on loan funds for water projects and then beefing up those projects to address seismic issues. So my Infrastructure Finance Authority board is keenly interested in seismic retrofitting, and they've given us a seismic standards. Bids are a little high. The first thing to go, or one of the first things, is that seismic standard, because that's driving up the cost. So we'd like to see if we can't build a carrot to ensure that those projects continue to be done. And just one thing before I leave off on this, that program called SIP that I had mentioned to you, there are certain ways to get it. I could tell you what SIP stands for, but you'll have to attend the first ever Oregon Infrastructure Conference October 20th and 21st in Salem to learn what that is. So I just wanted to leave that out there as a little suspense.
Well, thank you. And I can also add that in the Newport Big Creek dams, which were at the top of our current list of seismic vulnerability, not just for a major earthquake, but even a minor earthquake. When Senator Roland and I testified in support of that funding, we said if a big truck went past the dam and hit a pothole, we are at risk of losing the water supplies that are so critical to the people that live in our community, that work in our community, that come and visit our community. So the challenge being, as you well know, that
program that does tie the water supply in the Willamette because there is water supply behind those dams. But we have a very rigorous inspection program for those structures, both in the district and nationally, and have a system to, if there are things identified where improvements can be made, we either put in interim risk reduction measures in place, or we plan for, from a national perspective, what repairs or modifications need to happen. Just a comment on the Oregon coast as far as the facilities go. Of course, the jetties and the navigation channels, there's probably 3 ways that they will be affected through a seismic event. First of all, the jetties are not designed, and we don't design for the tsunami and for the Cascadia subduction zone. And the reason is because those facilities are fairly resilient. They're not like a rigid structure. And if you think of the cross-section of a jetty, if in fact there's an earthquake and it flattens out, as long as the rocks are still there, the functioning of the jetty as far as the river will maintain. It'll be less, but so therefore there, and plus it would be cost prohibitive to design. So we look at those facilities. And so the jetties themselves, and we believe, if they were shaken from an earthquake, that's likely what would happen. That you have to be prepared for, tsunami waves, 5 to 30 feet high, whatever the size of the waves that come through, and that would cause challenges to the jetties. However, they are right now. The jetties have been designed and withstand. Folks don't know this, on the Oregon coast, we have the equivalent of 4 hurricane-sized events every winter that affect those jetties, and they've been there for 100 years. And so that's the second way that they can be affected. And so for us, the last comment I'd have is on the response part. What would be critical for us goes back to the training piece and the communication. From how would we respond, we need to know what information there is. What are the conditions? Once the event happens, what is the conditions? What's the status of the jetties? Where, what situation are they in? Have they been breached? How do we need to repair? Where has the sand gone in the channel? Where do we need to go out? So having survey boats and figuring out, have bridges fallen into the navigation channel, how would we address? So it goes back to the very first, and the ability to communicate and work with our partners of understanding the situations, so then we can come up with plans to address. So you made me think of a couple of things.
Appreciate that. Well, I want to make sure that we save enough time for some questions from the audience. And I'm just going to start right over here, sir.
All right. 7 years ago, I listened to a FEMA presentation. I'm on a PUD board, and they said that at that particular stadium event, every bridge west of I-5 would go down. Period. Okay? So the question I want to ask, do you have any mutual aid agreements? That's what we do at our PUD. We send them out when there's a forest fire. We've already got the agreement made. They know how to act. We've gone across the country. We've gone into California. That's a great one. Or could you do a statewide, one day, everybody practice once? And would that work?
So you're asking if we have mutual aid agreements or whether it's practical to have statewide practice drills?
Yep.
Speaking of the mutual aid piece, we're part of the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, which is a national mutual aid program. I often say I'm less interested to know what Oregon's going to be doing after Cascadia, and much more interested to know what Florida and Colorado and Texas are going to be doing, because that's where our resources are going to be coming from. So bringing in structural engineers, National Guard bridge response teams to put portable bridges in place if that's something that's practical. Those are all things, tools we have in our toolbox. In terms of the drills, absolutely it's something we need to be doing more of and adding a level of realism to them and bringing in probably more partners than we typically do on a lot of our drills and exercises.
Great. This is the flash round, everybody. So we're asking quick questions and getting quick answers. I'm going to go back over here. Yeah? Yes?
Me?
Yes. So the question is an uplifting one. How many people are going to die?
Yeah, well, not. There's so many variables, a lot of wild cards. What time of year does it happen? There's going to be more people on the coast if it's July 4th weekend than if it's a Tuesday in January. Planning assumptions the numbers are in the thousands. No one's going to be patting me on the back if it's only 500 people. I think the message that we want to get out to folks is more people are going to survive than don't, and there's things that every organization can do to be disaster survivors and not disaster victims.
All right, this gentleman, and then over here, and then back there. Yes.
Hi, I've fought forest fires in Sequoias and coastal redwoods 6 years ago. I've done a lot of disaster work over the years. I live up the North Fork here. And I won an argument with the county and the feds and the state over keeping the upper North Fork Road open. The reason I'm concerned about transportation is I went through Paradise in February. And of course, most people know that 86 people died there, a great many because they couldn't get out, because they had narrowed their roads to permit bike lanes. And it caused such a jam that people were just stuck and roasted alive in their cars. Second thing is, I've got a friend that I stay with in Ventura who lives on a short road with cul-de-sacs. And they had a horrible fire there 2 years ago. It took him 3 hours to get 8 blocks when there was just one road and cul-de-sacs off either side. So obviously the problem is not only structural, jetties and all that. The problem is transportation and evacuation routes. And that's having been through this, that's my main concern. I wonder if you could address that. Thanks very much.
Brendan, any feedback on the transportation challenge and congestion?
Yeah, I mean, I deal a lot with congestion. It's just mostly in the Portland metro region. No, that's a good question. Not to make light of it. What happened in Paradise is obviously tragic. There is limited rights of way in the coastal areas, and I know that if Mike Harriman, our state resiliency officer, was here, he'd say that we need to do something to address that, to make the right of ways greater, especially in those areas. Obviously, there's going to be a cost to that, but it's one that should be considered.
If you could pass the microphone to this gentleman, and I think we've got time for 2 quick
Thank
questions.
you. My name is Frank Sunnigan, and I'm originally from Florence, Oregon. Now in Salem, Oregon. I've been to the capital lots of times. I want to ask the question, how many earthquakes have we, I call them salamis. How many of those we have on the Oregon coast?
So you're asking how many tsunamis or how many earthquakes we've had on the Oregon coast?
Yeah,
Well, I mean, a lot of damage.
so the geologic record has, I think there's a record of 42 large tsunamis off the Oregon coast. But the last one was
Brookings.
about the largest one. We've had a couple recently, but from Cascadia, that was back in 1700. So there was not a lot of development along the coast at the time.
Right. Don't they have some instruments out on is the Brookings out into the ocean where they test those before they occur? I think they have some instruments buried in the ocean out there, detectors as I understand, somewhere out there.
That is I know that's a project that they're working on. I typically, for myself, I look at the shaking as the predictor.
All right, I'm going to need to move to one last question, and then we're going to...
One question more. I was concerned about...
And after this question, Brenda, get the microphone back. Yes, please. What was your question? What was your last question?
Well, I was concerned about earthquakes on land you were talking about, and I don't remember how many we've had on the coastal area. We had some on land.
We do have some seismic faults. They're different, not as large magnitude. The Scotts Mills earthquake, I think in '94, there's one in Klamath Falls. So there's been a few of them. So it's a much broader seismic hazard than just Cascadia.
Thanks. Time for one last question. I'm sorry, if I missed this side of the room. Hello.
Hi, I'm Jamie Mills. I'm the city administrator for Dune City. We have a population of about 1,326 people, and we're just south of Florence, but we'll be in alignment. We also are surrounded by state and federal parks. So at any given time, our community, we're the only evacuation center, we end up having to house 10 to 15,000 people. I just want you to remember that. And you to remember it when it comes to funding. Big cities aren't the only ones who need some help. Mr. Bryce, you mentioned that you would be responsible for debris removal. I don't pretend to think that you're going to come to us first. So what is it? Is there some resources somewhere that I can find out how to take care of the debris? Doug Emmy indicates, and yes, they have given me an idea based on our housing, how old it is, and how many people are in the inundation zone, as to how many body bags to keep. But they also said most of it is because of debris. So most of the damage and most of the injuries are because of debris. Is there something as a small city that I can prepare for now? Get some equipment, reserve a spot, come up with a plan, and do you have any kind of written resources that can help me figure out how to plan?
Ma'am, because of time, a very short answer is Lance Lindsay, raise your hand again. Please talk to Lance because he can give you all the details of the work with you, and I think that he'll be able to help plan that for you. Bigger picture, the Corps has a responsibility. We have teams across the nation for an emergency that they can come in and react to the emergency. But Lance should be able to help you out.
And the point is well taken, that our communities are not just simply a reflection of the number on the sign as you come into town, but how many people come to visit us. And in my district, the city of Newport, 10,000 people. On August summer afternoon, that can turn into 50,000 people. I'm going to take one more quick, loud question back here.
All right, this is another uplifting question. I live in Coos Bay, where I think the number of people who have stockpiled food and water is somewhat outnumbered by those who have stockpiled guns and ammunition. So I'm concerned about the rapid decay of civil order and public safety. What are we thinking about that?
Public safety in response to the...
Lord of the Flies.
Gentlemen, anybody have any comments on what steps we anticipate?
Somebody turned off my mic. I was going to turn that one over to Representative Brocksmith.
Well, Andrew, maybe some closing comments. I mean, certainly after an event occurs, we all understand that we're going to be pretty much on our own for a couple of weeks. We're being asked to make preparations. Some people prepare differently than others do. But what is the sense of our public safety environment in the immediate aftermath?
Job number one for us is going to be to save and sustain lives and obtain and maintain situational awareness. It's one of those great disaster myths that society breaks down after a disaster, that there's rioting and looting. People always cite Hurricane Katrina. Most of that stuff has been debunked in terms of the war crime atrocities that were alleged to have occurred in that city. There's certainly pockets of it that happens, but the research shows that generally people band together, come together, and support each other during a disaster. That said, we've never experienced a disaster like the Cascadia subduction and earthquake anytime in our country's history. So we may learn a whole lot of new things. I will also add with the schools and educating our kids. Interesting fact, kids make up 25% of our population, but 100% of our future. So anything we can do to prepare our kids and start building that culture of preparedness at that level is going to be a huge dividend moving forward.
Well said.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the panel, and thanks to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you taking some time on this important subject. The next program will be across the hall in the theater, but if you've got questions for any of us, we will be here and happy to continue the conversation. Thanks again.